We've all seen the epoxy river cutting boards on YouTube. They're a creative way to add a new feature to the same old cutting board. Today, I'm going to take you step by step through the process of making one of these impressive boards. I'll also provide some tips along the way to help you avoid some of the problems that can arise when working with epoxy resin. So, let's head into the shop. When making an epoxy river cutting board, you can use just about anything for your side pieces. I'm using a live edge cut off from a previous project of mine. To get started, I'm going to measure the stock and cut it in half at the miter saw. I'll first cut the end of the stock to square it up. Now I'll cut the stock in half. I now have equal length pieces of stock, and I'm simply going to rotate one of the pieces so that the live edges are facing each other. This will form the river or channel where the epoxy resin will be poured. So that the resin has something to bind or anchor to when poured, I'm drilling several holes along the side face of each live edge. I don't need to drill too deep, just about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. Then I repeat the process on the other side. You'll want to make sure to turn the stock over after you've completed drilling and give it a few gentle taps to remove any debris from the holes. Here's where I'm going to take an easier approach for preparing the epoxy pour. In many videos, you'll see a frame is built around the piece and then sealed with tape or caulking to prevent leaks. This is an excellent approach, and depending on how large of a pour you're performing, might be absolutely necessary. Since this is a fairly small cutting board, I'm not going to build a frame. Instead, I have purchased a 4-inch wide silver aluminum adhesive tape. I'll align one of the piece's live edge so that it extends approximately 1/2 inch over the tape's edge. Then I'll press the piece firmly in place. Then I'll align the other side so the channel created is roughly 3 inches wide. In my case, about 9 inches from outside edge to outside edge. When I've got that side aligned, I'll press it down firmly to the aluminum adhesive tape. At the end of the board, I'll fold the adhesive tape to create a barrier so the epoxy is contained when poured. Then, using a flat rubber scraper, I'll press the bottom flat. You won't be able to get all of the wrinkles out, but you want to mitigate any deep creases. Even though I feel the channel created by the tape is leak-proof, for a little extra insurance, I add another half strip of tape to both sides. I really don't want any surprises during the pour. Now comes the fun part, mixing and pouring the epoxy. I've got my clear epoxy resin, measuring and mixing cup, various mica powders, and sticks. But hold on, shouldn't we figure out just how much epoxy we need to mix up for our pour? Looks like it's time for a little math. Okay, I'm not a fan of math either. So I googled an online volume calculator. Since I'm using inches, I simply enter the length, width, and thickness of my pour, and then let it calculate how many ounces of resin I need to mix up. Easy peasy. In my case, I need about 18 ounces. Now back to the fun stuff. Epoxy resin is sticky stuff, and you should always read the instructions for the specific resin that you're using. Make sure to use gloves and even a mask, and mix in a well-ventilated area. The epoxy I'm using is a 2-part 1-to-1 ratio epoxy. That means that I'll mix equal parts of A and B. Remember, I need 18 ounces, but that would fill the cup I'm using, so I'm going to start by mixing just 10 ounces for the first pour, then I'll come back and mix the additional 8 ounces. Now the mixing begins. It will take several minutes of stirring to incorporate and combine the two parts. After I've achieved a good mix, I'll add my colored mica powders. Here's where you get to be creative. If you want the traditional blue river, then go for it. I really wanted a metallic gold fleck appearance, so I'm using black, white, and bronze mica powders. I'm not being too specific on the ratios either, just a small scoop of each. You'll want to spend a good amount of time incorporating the colored mica powders into the resin. Once you feel like you've gotten the color and the appearance you want, then it's on to the pour. As you can see, I've placed the tape cutting board in a cardboard box, just some extra protection from any seepage that may occur. I really feel like a confectioner pouring out chocolate onto a table. I'm really digging the metallic look. After this first pour, I'll use a small torch to remove any pockets of air that have risen to the surface of the epoxy. Simply skim the torch over the surface and you'll see the epoxy release the bubbles. Then it's on to pouring the additional 8 ounces. I don't let the epoxy cure between layers, but keep in mind that that can be done depending on the type and breadth of project you're working on. I'll then follow up again with the torch to remove any air bubbles that have come to the surface. I could leave the epoxy as poured, but what's the fun in that? I want to see all of those colors, so I'm taking my original mixing stick and swirling them gently in different directions until I achieve the desired look. Don't get too vigorous with your technique though, as you may cause more bubbles, and remember, the bottom of the channel is just a thin foil barrier. You don't want to risk puncturing it. After curing overnight, I can remove the board from the spillover container. I did have one very small leak, but not enough to raise any alarm. Now it's time to get this board planed and sanded to thickness, but first I'll spend an obnoxious amount of time removing this adhesive aluminum tape. When I poured the epoxy on this project, I purposely underfilled the channel just slightly. That way the planer is removing wood down to the epoxy rather than the other way around. Once the planer is removing equal material, I move over to the drum sander where I can get a good base sanding on both sides. I did identify a few small voids in the epoxy, but don't worry, we'll be addressing those shortly. With the base sanding completed, I need to turn my attention to those voids. I'm going to mix up a small amount of 5-minute epoxy and then apply them to each area that I identified. Luckily, all of these will appear on the bottom side of the cutting board when finished. Theoretically, I could continue to work on the board after 5 minutes or so, but since the friction from the drum sander might soften this 5-minute epoxy, I let it dry for a good hour or so before continuing. Alas, there always comes a time for hand sanding. It is by far my least favorite part of any project. You'll notice that I always speed up these sections of my videos. Just know that I typically start with around 100 grit sandpaper and work up to around 320. However, because of the epoxy component of this particular cutting board, I'll need to finish that part with a much higher grit sandpaper, and I'll move on to wet pads. Before I move on to wet sanding the epoxy, I want to give the board a quick once-over with denatured alcohol to remove as much sanding dust as possible. These are the wet sanding pads that I'll be using on the epoxy, and they range from 1500 to 12,000 grit. But before I begin, I want to tape off the wood part of the cutting board. It doesn't need to be sanded with the higher grit pads, and the tape will also protect the wood from the wet sanding. If you're unfamiliar with wet sanding pads, they're used for buffing and polishing scratches out of things like epoxy. Wet sanding lubricates the surface being sanded, which reduces scratches. The water also carries away loose pieces of abrasive as well as finish particles. I keep a small spray bottle filled with water in my shop. I simply spray a small amount of water to the epoxy surface, then begin working the sanding pad. Done with the side, I'll wipe it with a paper towel and work on the other side, up through the different grits until I'm happy with the finished surface. As a final step, I apply some Howard's Restore-A-Shine. While it's made for wood, I found the micro-polishing powders work well on epoxy too. Just a small amount on a soft cloth and a little elbow grease will finish up the shine on this epoxy nicely. Let's just pause a moment to enjoy this golden metallic epoxy river. Well, it's reveal time. Into a nice bath of mineral oil. Whoa, wait just a minute. Just teasing. This turned out awesome. I'm really happy with my color choices on this one. After an overnight drip dry, we're finishing this board off with Howard's cutting board conditioner. And last but not least, some feet. As this is a small board and a relatively thin one in terms of thickness, I'm just using these rubber bumper type feet. They do have an adhesive, but I like to add just a spot of CA glue on them to ensure they stay attached for a long time. To ensure the feet adhere properly, I add a little weight while the CA glue dries. The next day, it's time for a final inspection and to remedy any lingering issues. I'd say we're good on this one. I hope you enjoyed this project and found it helpful. Please feel free to leave comments and suggestions for different techniques and tips that you would have used. Likes are always appreciated, and if you know of someone who would enjoy this type of video, please share it with them. As always, thanks for watching.